Hello everyone, it's Jamal Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. So I remember Ed Shultz on MSNBC, this kind of pugnacious lefty, unabashed lefty. The guy who was fighting for the unions and everything else. That's how I remember Ed Shultz. When Scott Walker took office in Wisconsin, Scott Walker had open season on unions, and unions fought back. And Ed Shultz was at Rebel headquarters. He was at the well, essentially there with unions. I thought Ed Shultz was going to jump off of a bridge when they finally couldn't take Walker out of that seat. But they did take down multiple state senators or state legislatures who supported Walker's union busting. So you can say in some degree he was successful, in some degree not. But it's kind of besides the point. The person who was there representing that interest was Ed. And that's the way I remember him. And so he always got a hell of a lot of credit for me for doing that. Ed Shultz was suddenly removed from MSNBC. Just kind of out of the blue. One day, he's not there. I didn't necessarily know why Ed wasn't there. And one of my subscribers, Adrian Lee, thank you, Adrian Lee, posted a clip that's somewhat mind-blowing, but not necessarily mind-blowing, but it kind of is mind-blowing. It's one of those things where you believe that there's influence. I always believe that there's a certain influence. I believe that MSNBC is essentially Democratic functionaries, that they function at the behest of the party. They work somewhat hand in hand, almost in tandem with one another. They're like a mouthpiece. They're a propaganda arm of Democrats. Now, people, when they don't realize that, they get sucked into the information as if the information is completely true. The information has a bias and a slant. And the same way that Fox News has a bias and a slant. The slant varies depending on what's the story. There may be some stories at Fox News that are run that can be true, and they run those stories as true because they can hit Democrats and be true. But at the same token, they're perfectly okay with cutting a story a particular way or reading a story a particular way. Both are. Rachel Maddow running on Russiagate nonsense constantly. Trump and Russia, Trump and Iranians, Trump and the mob. Some of it may be true. Some of the details may be true. But there's a context that's always missing because Rachel Maddow always punches at one, making it look as if one is your savior and the other one is your devil. I'm saying neither one is your savior. The fact that the story is cut a particular way is getting across, I guess you can say, a misstatement in reality itself. A misstatement in reality itself. And I hope that makes sense. It's if you're looking at me, if you're coming to me, and every story that I give you is Republicans suck, Republicans suck, Republicans suck, Republicans suck. By definition, it's not by definition, but what is the impression you're going to leave with? Republicans are fucking horrible, and Democrats are your friend. And I'm saying Democrats are not your friend. Republicans may be horrible, but Democrats are not your friend. The very fact that you don't necessarily really criticize one, you give one somewhat of a pass in the majority of the situations, then by virtue of somebody looking at your channel, they're going to get this impression that they're the problem. They're the problem. Just like Fox News. Fox News hitting Democrats, so it gives the impression that Democrats are the problem. You create a division in your society where people believing one and the other, missing the point that it's both. Missing the point that it's both. Ed was unceremoniously removed from MSNBC. As far as I know, his ratings were perfectly okay, but Ed was removed from MSNBC. The clip that Adrian Lee posts is Ed discussing his removal from MSNBC, and it is mind-blowing. At least I think it is. To some degree. I always believe in a certain amount of influence, like I said, a tangent between the Democratic Party and MSNBC. I consider them those things working in tandem with one another. But I never necessarily know the influence. How much influence does one exert on the other? Is that influence direct or is that influence indirect? I assume that influence to a certain degree was indirect. But perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps I was wrong. Take a listen at what Ed says. And take a listen at what Ed says as the reason why, or two things. The level of influence that was exerted on MSNBC, and two, why he believes he was fired. Adrian Lee, thank you very much. Great clip. That's great audio, I should say. It's never looked.
My question is, how would you describe working at MSNBC versus RT? What are the differences? What are the similarities?
Well, I appreciate the question. This is the best job I've ever had in my 42 years of broadcasting. It's the best company I've ever worked for. It's the most freedom I've ever had. And I have really grown on the level of international knowledge and foreign relations, which has been very career rewarding. I've been able to travel the world. I've been able to interview
with RT.
With RT, been able to interview numerous people from different countries that have a totally different perspective than what Americans have. I'm doing real journalism. It's not opinion. I anchor the news. I facilitate a discussion, and I enjoy this role very much. It's really been a real pleasure working here for the last 2.5 years, and I really don't know when I'm going to give it up. I'm enjoying it that much.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you, Ed.
But let me go back, if I may, because you said, what are the differences?
Yes.
And I want to make this very clear, and I hope your audience consumes this. There was more oversight and more direction given to me on content at MSNBC than there ever has been here at RT. And I think that it's very sad that that story is not getting out. I think it's many times I was told what to lead with on MSNBC. Many times I was told what I was not going to do, and I've got a story that had I not been involved in it, I would have never believed it. And Phil Griffin, who I consider a friend to this day, was a watchdog, far more than anything I am exposed to here at RT America.
Did he tell you what to say? Did he tell you an angle to take?
Often. In fact, when Bernie Sanders was announcing that he was going to be a candidate for the nomination to the Democratic Party in Burlington, Vermont, I was the only cable host between Fox, MSNBC, and CNN that was there live to cover it. Now, there were live cameras there, but we had coordinated with the Sanders campaign that at 5 o'clock he was going to make his announcement, and we were going to cover this on the Ed Show. I go to Bernie Sanders' house that afternoon, an interview in the backyard, about a 15-minute interview. The grandkids are running around. It's a big day for the Sanders family. He's going to announce that he's running for president. We're going to carry it live later on in the day, and we're going to run this one-on-one tape with Bernie. 3,000 people are there on Lake Champlain. It's 5 minutes to air, and I get a phone call from Phil Griffin, "You're not covering this." I said, "Phil, Bernie Sanders is announcing he's running for president. He's going to be a president. I don't care. You're not covering this." And it got rather contentious. And
Why, though?
I don't, well, now you're asking me for opinion. I'm giving you fact right now about what happened. Mm-hmm. And other people who were there with me.
Just to make a quick point. In the same way that Eminem, like, have you ever? I don't know if they do this at the movies in other states, but sometimes when it first comes on, there's like these different commercials, and sometimes one of the commercials is an Eminem commercial, and it's this little yellow Eminem and this little chubby brown Eminem, and they're talking to the audience, and they're moving and shaking and everything else. That's not the company itself. That's not real. That's a digital mouthpiece that they've created to kind of entice you, to give you this impression of what the company is, when that's really not what the company is at all. I kind of look at Lawrence O'Donnell, Rachel Maddow, and these other guys as somewhat of the same thing. Yes, they have them there, but insofar as they do whatever the corporation wants them to do, they don't really need oversight. If you're not doing what the corporation needs to do, they need to prod you into place. Meaning, they're not really human and personalities among themselves. If Ed can't get out and say what Ed wants to say, then Ed is not really Ed in this case. This is a corporation essentially prodding Ed to say certain things in a way that Ed may say them, but they're corporate-friendly things that in no way challenge the power structure because, well, they're corporate-friendly things. They benefit from having the human element because people look at it and it says, oh, there's a person there. And yes, there's aspects of the person that come through, but what that person is recounting to you are just corporate-friendly narratives that support one of the political parties. That's all it is. The person is almost like a guise or disguise or like a trick of sorts, kind of like the little M&M running across the screen. Let's let him finish. I'm fascinated by this conversation. I'm always thrilled by the little private conversations that people have. I know this sounds weird, but I love these conversations. Part of the reason why I love the Nixon tapes is because I like hearing what they're talking about behind the scenes. What's actually real, not the disguise, like not the thing that you're showing me, not the Senate, not the mask. What's beneath? Those conversations are the things that are beneath. Him recounting this, saying, this is the conversation I had about Bernie Sanders where he says, you're not covering Bernie Sanders. You're not covering Bernie Sanders. I don't care if he's a sitting senator. You're not doing it. Shut up. I find that this is the reality of it. Whatever MSNBC makes you think it is based on the narratives or the anchors that they have on, the reality is a corporate structure, a corporate system that is in line with one of the political parties and political establishments. Listen to why he thinks that he was fired, by the way, and why he thinks they didn't want him to play or show the Bernie Sanders thing. It's fascinating.
Will attest to the fact and back me up that this is what happened. We were told that we had to cover something down in Texas that was totally meaningless, and another press conference in Baltimore, which was already had been in the news for a few days. We're covering Bernie Sanders live. We're coordinated with his campaign. And I'm told 5 minutes before, you're not covering Bernie Sanders. Now, let me give you the opinion. I think the Clintons were connected to Andy Lack, connected at the hip. I think that they didn't want anybody in their prime time or anywhere in their lineup supporting Bernie Sanders. I think that they were in the tank for Hillary Clinton, and I think it was managed, and 45 days later, I was out at MSNBC. And I thought it stunk. They gave me my contract. I signed a non-disclosure agreement and also a no bad-mouthing agreement, which I felt good with because I thought that this was over time all going to wash out. And I knew if Bernie Sanders didn't win, he was going to run again because the man is determined. So I was patient and took my money and went on. But the fact of the matter is I think I've got a hell of a story to tell. And when you see how the campaign unfolded, Donna Brazile feeding Hillary Clinton questions at the campaign, the DNC undercutting Bernie Sanders, the superdelegates that were organized by Hillary Clinton. I mean, in my state of Minnesota, where I'm a resident and pay taxes, Al Franken and Amy Klobuchar were superdelegates, and despite the fact that Bernie Sanders won Minnesota, they supported Clinton. It was the fix was in. The fix was in with the mainstream media. The fix was in with managing the news and shutting down Bernie Sanders. And it wasn't until he started matching the Clintons and raising money that he became, well, we got to cover this guy. But from the start, the Clintons didn't want any competition. They didn't want Bernie Sanders around. They didn't want the Keystone XL pipeline. They didn't want to push her on that issue. They didn't want to push her on free education for all. And they certainly didn't want to push her on the TPP and also universal health care. Those were four main issues that Bernie Sanders, had he not been in the campaign, Hillary Clinton would have never had to address. And so I think the fix was in early on to Deep Six Bernie. To this day, it kind of pisses me off.
That is mind-blowing. And yet it's not. Like, if you were around during the campaign and you saw what was taking place, they wouldn't cover Bernie Sanders at all. Donald Trump, I remember to this day, empty podium. They're covering an empty podium. And Bernie Sanders is having a rally. And there are like 20,000 people at the rally. They believed that they could completely ignore his campaign and he would go away. And when it wasn't going away, when it was feel of the burn, then they were stuck. Gotta cover him. Gotta cover him. Don't have a choice but to cover him. But that's not the way it started off in the beginning. And even then, when they covered him, you had these snide remarks by Joanne Reed and some of the people on the case. In an odd way, the Morning Joe, in an odd way, it took the Republican to give, at the very least, this kind of, wow, it looks like they're cheating Sanders. It looks like they're cheating Bernie Sanders. And yeah, he's a Republican, so of course he wants to put a knife in Clinton to some degree. But again, it's almost like the bias that a person has. There's some biases that allow a person to be a little bit more true because of the bias. So if you want to say that he's a Republican, he doesn't necessarily like Democrats, then it lends more towards the sign of being looking at the flaws and the faults of Democrats. And he sees this and is like, that doesn't seem fair that Bernie Sanders wins Vermont, and yet the superdelegate count ends up being somewhat the same. That seems a little unfair. No shit, Joe. That seems unfair to me, too. Seems unfair to a lot of Bernie Sanders supporters. So, yeah, I love that. I love inside baseball. That's all. I like it when these guys are saying something that's going on behind the scenes that you know that these type of conversations exist, because you know that as people talking, they're not exposing each and everything that happens in the public. And I love these conversations when they're exposed. He's telling you as a flat fact that he was shut down on multiple stories and he was shut down on a Bernie Sanders story. Flat fact. Now, it's speculation on the whole, I think the fix was in from the beginning and everything else. But as a flat fact, a senator is announcing his run for president of the United States, and MSNBC, for the most part, has aligned itself with a particular person, and MSNBC does not want the Bernie Sanders to come to fruition. So, shut up, go somewhere else, cover a story that doesn't matter at all. Cover a story that doesn't matter at all. But Ed goes so far as to say he thinks he was fired for the Bernie Sanders thing. That is amazing. That's amazing. So, I'm going to leave this here. I will say, Adrian, Leah, thank you very much for giving me this video. Much appreciated. All right, guys. If you enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe, and of course, you can always support the Patreon. Thanks, everyone.